Why was this man's life lost for such a petty reason? It's obscene.
Angry protesters pounding the pavement across New York and other parts of the country, speaking out against the grand jury's decision in the Eric Garner case. Welcome back to RFL. We have some protests that are happening right now around the country. We want to take you to Somerville, Massachusetts. That is just outside Boston, where there are protests that we're getting there. There are protests within Boston as well. And we've also seen in the last hour protests in Cleveland, and that's the scene in Boston tonight. There are also protests as we speak in Cleveland, Ohio. This in the light of the Justice Department report about police brutality in Cleveland. Now, as for what those protesters are saying, on Thursday, our Dominic Carter spoke with protesters in Foley Square. Let's take a look.
We can't breathe. The police has been messing with us, and the decision, the verdict was not, I don't think it was very accurate. I think it was, I don't know, it was unfair. We should have learned from Mike Brown, that situation that the police are really killing us in America. I don't think that this decision was fair.
And how do you feel?
I feel like it could happen to anybody. Everybody in the streets ain't safe. Minorities ain't safe. People of color's not safe. Anybody. Just like it happened to Eric Garner, it could happen to anybody. It could happen to me going home right now. And I live very close to where the situation happened. Like, so it's like it has me fearing for my life. Like,
are you really worried that you could have an encounter with the police officer that may not end well?
We've had many encounters with the police, and every time we never got rid of our rights. They always come mess with us, and it's just because of where we live, or because, you know, we're from the projects. They just come mess with us because we look a certain way. And we really can't breathe with the police.
This is about the community coming out because we are hurt, we are angry, we are devastated at the lack of accountability with the Eric Garner verdict, the Mike Brown verdict. You know, we're just tired of feeling targeted by the police, and by we I mean like communities of color, you know, folks that are targeted disproportionately. And we're just coming out to express ourselves because we have the right to do that.
What exactly is the problem? I know that may sound like a very naive question, but from your perspective, young lady, what exactly is the problem?
The problem is that, you know, there is this feeling that the police are above the law. You know, they do things, they commit crimes that if it were a regular person would have different consequences. And the problem is that we are, as a people for decades, have been targeted and have been, you know, abused, and we are just tired of it. We're just coming out to say that enough is enough. You know, like Eric Garner said, this stops today, and we are just here to do that.
All right, you've heard from the protesters. Now we want you to hear from our panel tonight. C. Scott Vanderhoef is an attorney and former 5-term Rockland County executive. Thank you for being here. And we're joined by Basil Smikle, political analyst and an adjunct professor at Columbia University. And first of all, Basil, your reaction when you see these protests, it's impressive in terms of the people hitting the streets, but the overall impact, what's your reaction?
Well, the impact is that it's definitely disrupting, I think, a lot of the normal flow of business in New York City and certainly in other cities across the country. I hope that calls attention to the issue. The question that I have with this protest, as I did with Occupy Wall Street, is let's actually at the end of all of this sit down and talk about what our goals are, what our next steps are. Because it's one thing to express your outrage, and that's important, and I think it's necessary, but we want to give our elected leaders and decision makers an opportunity to take demands and say, this is what we can do to make change.
Scott, is it enough to just vent frustration and say things need to change, or do you agree with Basil that there needs to be specific items that are being requested by these protesters, saying we want A, B, and C changed?
Well, I think Basil's right on. I mean, I think it's one thing to demonstrate. By the way, it's another thing to demonstrate and violate the law, which I don't condone. But the purpose of the demonstrations is to get change, because we know there's social injustice. We know there are issues out there. But I also get the feeling that folks have forgotten that law enforcement and the justice system overall do work. You know, we've painted the whole thing instead of focusing on the issue. Poor communities that can't afford to do things. You know, the whole process of what society has to deal with. So I think it's absolutely essential that we get through this. All right, we've vented, we've done it. Now what? I mean, now what do we do about police training? What do we do about law enforcement? What do we do about rebuilding the confidence in the justice system, which I think is critical for our country?
Right.
Short of listing specific goals, as we're seeing the police retraining that Bill de Blasio has been pushing for in New York City, but short of listing and enumerating specific goals, Can these protests be effective at bringing about change, even if it's a little unsure as to what that change specifically should be?
Well, I think they can, and I think I dismiss most of the politicians' comments about it because they're responding. It requires action, is what I'm trying to say. It's not enough to say we need to understand that all life is important. Well, of course it is. I mean, what's important is how you deal with, in this issue, a minor grade infraction of an individual. You know, how do the police deal with that? And I just think my main concern, however, across the country and certainly in New York, is that we are seeing a reaction which may be understandable, but we do not want to get into the lynch mob mentality in any of this. We've got to get back to the realities.
As we continue looking at the pictures out of Boston there, and now some dated pictures from New York, Basil, again, to the effectiveness of these protests. I mean, it's enough to make you take a step back and say, wow, this is not going away. This is not a 1 or 2 day story. But is this enough as it's constituted now to actually affect the change that these protesters are hoping for?
I'm not so sure. And I also go back to Occupy Wall Street. You know, we had a lot of protest, a lot of sort of national media attention there, but I'm not exactly sure what we got out of it. Certainly there is more of a conversation on the Democratic left, the ideological left, to say that there's a need for more progressive action in our national politics. I don't know if that was a direct result of the Occupy Wall Street movement or something else. So similarly, as I bring it to this, you know, I don't want there to be a lagging effect of these protests. I want the action now. I want the legislative action now. And I want there to be some kind of articulation of what needs to happen. I think there should be special prosecutors for officers when in shootings such as this. But how do we change the law to get to that place? Those are the conversations that need to happen.
Well, I think too, to the point, I mean, the whole idea of the militarization of police forces, we saw it in Ferguson, and I think the president spoke about this, and I think he's right. I mean, you got to ratchet down how we respond to any kind of protest.
Speaking of that response, I mean, the difference between what we're seeing from the police in New York versus what we saw in Ferguson, and also from the protesters, it's stark. I mean, there have been about 250 arrests all told in the last couple of days. But Scott, you said before, as long as the protesters aren't violating the law, they're not engaging in property damage like we saw in Ferguson, but they are violating the law by blocking traffic, and yet it seems the NYPD is allowing this. You are an executive, a governmental executive. Where's the line for police, and how do you think the NYPD is handling it?
I think they're handling it very well. There were 200 arrests last night. They've tried to disrupt, and there were those folks say burn the Christmas tree down at Rockefeller Center. You know, this is not the way to respond, and I think that they've responded very well. In order to demonstrate, you need permits. They don't have them. It's a violation of the law. On the other hand, people have a right to display their anger, and we understand it. I mean, this is a senseless killing in my view, but two wrongs don't make the right.
Basil?
No, I agree. And this Commissioner Bratton said something earlier. He said, you know, I want to be able to talk to the leader of these protests, but there's no real leader. It sort of changes on a day-to-day basis. And again, I think that's a big issue that I think needs to be addressed, which is, okay, if we're going to actually do this and it's going to be sustained, we want to get organized so that it just doesn't last this week, that this is actually part of some stronger movement.
All right, we're going to take a break here. Up next, interesting interview that Dominic had with Congressman Charlie Rangel. He's speaking exclusively to RFL about the grand jury's decision about Staten Island DA Dan Donovan, about racism in America, and Congressman Rangel was hopping mad during that interview. We're going to play it for you right now, or after a quick break.